And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather graphic looking something like this. Big storm here just south of the eastern Aleutians, now tracking east-northeastward. So that's going to spread wind and rain up to Kodiak Island this evening into Bristol Bay. Increasing chances of rain and clouds here across southern Alaska, with the precipitation staying out along the coastline. Strong north winds on the backside of this system from about Atka Island over toward Nikolsky. You could see gusts 60 miles an hour. Good gales in advance of this front as well. And a cold front bringing some moisture into the western Arctic coast areas. Dry over the interior with light winds, mostly dry with light winds over the southeast coast. And for tomorrow, front pushes eastward here, low sliding northeastward south of the Alaska Peninsula. Rain, Kodiak Island, rain and wind developing here over the northern Gulf of Alaska with gale force winds in advance of this front, and moisture spreading up into Prince William Sound and even into eastern Turnagain Arm. Increasing chances of rain along the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range, but for the most part, the areas to the north staying dry with light winds. Chance of snow with this cold front along the western Arctic coast into the western Brooks Range and down into the Bering Strait. And wind starting to subside a little for the eastern Aleutians, but still a pretty windy, wet day there, and wet into Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim Delta, or Kuskokwim Valley, in the southern Kuskokwim Valley. And then we'll see for Sunday that low tracks into the Gulf of Alaska and weakens considerably. Another trough will bring increasing rain and showers into the Panhandle during the afternoon hours. Still generally a wet day there on Sunday, and periods of rain for the North Gulf Coast and portions of the Kenai Peninsula becoming showery for Kodiak Island, with some clearing here over southern Cook Inlet in the western interior, but showers over the southeastern Bering Sea. Coastal water forecast: southern Panhandle, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots for Saturday, south to southeast 25 for the central coast, and the north coast, east winds 25 to 35 knots with seas 8 to 13 feet. And south 15 for Lynn Canal, southeast 15 with higher gusts for Stevens Passage, southeast winds 15 knots for Clarence Strait with 3-foot seas. And then for Clarence Strait on Sunday, southeast winds 20 knots, seas up to 6 feet, south winds 20 knots for Stevens Passage, southeast 20 for Lynn Canal, and pretty uniform wind pattern here along the coast, southeast 30 knots with seas 11 to 12 feet. And for Prince William Sound tomorrow, east winds 25 knots, gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast, and for east winds 35 to 40 knots with seas around 10 feet. And for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots, strongest south of the Forelands with seas 8 to 10 feet. East winds 45 knots for the Barren Islands, seas up to 12 feet, and good gales into Kamishak Bay right out of the east at 40 knots. And the outlook for Sunday, Kamishak Bay, those winds swing around to the northwest at 35 knots, north 30 knots with 9-foot seas here for the Barren Islands, north 30 knots, southern Cook Inlet, north 25, north of the Forelands, 7 to 10-foot seas. And Prince William Sound, east winds 25 knots, seas 4 feet. Northeast 15, some winds really coming down here for the western North Gulf Coast, and east-southeast 20 to 25 knots around Middleton Island. Kodiak Island for Saturday, east winds 30 to 35 knots, 35-knot easterlies here for the Alaska, or for the Bristol Bay area, Alaska Peninsula, east-northeast 15 to 20 knots. And for Sunday, Bristol Bay, northwest winds 20 knots, northwest 20 to 25 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Kodiak Island, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots, seas 10 to 14 feet around the island there. Gale warnings for the Fox Islands tomorrow, north to northeast winds 35 knots, seas up to 18 feet, and northwest 30 knots here for Adak and Atka. It could be stronger in the morning hours, and seas up to 12 feet, and then really dropping off here over the western Aleutians, variable at 10 from Kiska to Shemya. And for Sunday, variable winds 10 knots continue out in that area. Central Aleutians, north to northwest 15 knots, seas 4 to 6 feet. And for the eastern Aleutian areas, we've got still small craft advisories for Unalaska Island for north to northwest 25 to 30 knots, 15 to 20 knots around Nikolsky. And for the southwest coast, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Yukon Delta, or for the St. Lawrence Island area, northeast at 20, east 15 for Norton Sound, And the Pribilof Islands, looking at north winds at 30 knots with 12-foot seas. St. Matthew Island north at 25. And for Sunday, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, the southwest coast, St. Matthew Island, all north at 25 knots. Pribilofs north at 20 knots with 7-foot seas. And for the eastern Arctic coast, south winds tomorrow 10 to 15 knots, south at 20 on the central coast. Small craft advisories for the western Arctic coast, southwest 25 with 6-foot seas. Chukchi Sea, southwest winds 10 to 20 knots with 2 to 5-foot seas. And small craft advisories for the Chukchi Sea on Sunday for north winds 25 knots. Southwest winds 10 knots for the western Arctic coast, west at 10 for the central coast, and north to west winds 10 to 15 knots there for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast.